In the autumn of 1973, when the forests of Harlan County were shedding their final, brittle leaves, everyone thought the mountains had shown them all their horrors. They were wrong. A thick, unnatural fog rolled in from the old Haverly property, smothering sound and making even grown men murmur prayers under their breath. No one had stepped near the collapsing house or the half-buried barn in years, not after the stories of what the Haverly Clan did beneath that roof. The discovery in the woods began like any ordinary afternoon for the two hunters who wandered deeper into Harlan County's aging forests than they usually dared to go. The sun was weak that day, filtered through branches stripped bare by the early cold, and every step through the fallen leaves echoed louder than it should have. The hunters weren't looking for anything unusual. They only wanted to follow the trail of a wounded buck. But as they neared the forgotten land once owned by the Haverly family, the forest changed in a way neither man could quite explain. The air grew still, heavy, as if holding its breath. A strange hush settled over the woods, muting even the usual calls of distant crows. Then, without warning, fog began rising from the soil itself, creeping low across the ground with a slow, deliberate movement that felt too purposeful to be natural. One of the hunters, a man named Briggs, lifted his rifle instinctively, sensing something wrong long before he could see it. His partner whispered a warning, but the words were swallowed almost instantly by the thickening mist. When they pushed forward, the fog parted just enough to reveal the old Haverly barn, half-collapsed, beams sagging, swallowed by vines that looked more like skeletal fingers. No one had been near the place in more than a decade, not since the clan vanished without explanation. Yet something about the atmosphere suggested they were not alone. Briggs stepped closer and froze. Standing beside the barn, arranged in a perfect line as if placed there intentionally, were three children. They were barefoot, unmoving, and staring straight ahead with eyes that didn't seem to register the hunter's presence. Their clothes were old, thin, and dust-covered, clinging to them like they had been standing in that exact spot for hours, or maybe years. Their skin, pale as moonlight, seemed almost translucent in the dim forest light. The hunters exchanged a look of disbelief, unsure whether to call out or run. The children didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't even seem to breathe. Briggs slowly lowered his rifle, sensing that any sudden movement might trigger something he couldn't understand. When he approached, the fog thickened again as if trying to pull the children back into it. A cold dread crawled up his spine. He could feel the weight of the land itself pressing in, as if the forest was watching, waiting. And while neither hunter could explain why, they both felt the same chilling truth settle into their bones. Whatever had happened to the Haverly family wasn't over. It had only been waiting to be found. When the sheriff arrived at the scene, he expected to deal with missing kids, maybe runaways, or at worst, children abandoned by some desperate family passing through the mountains. But the moment he stepped through the fog and saw the three children lined beside the barn, he felt a tightness in his chest that no training had ever prepared him for. Their stillness was unnatural, almost practiced, and their vacant eyes held a glassy brightness that made it difficult to tell where the reflection of the forest ended and their gaze began. The hunters stood several paces back, refusing to get any closer, their faces pale as if they had already seen too much. The sheriff tried speaking to the children, but none of them blinked or turned, not even when he called out loudly, the sound barely carrying through the heavy air. Unsure whether they were injured or in shock, he stepped forward cautiously and reached for the smallest child, a girl who couldn't have been more than 6. Her skin was oddly cool, not the cold of fear or exposure, but a deeper cold, like the chill of something that had never been touched by sunlight. As he brushed away the thin layer of dirt coating her arm, he expected pale skin beneath, maybe bruises or scratches from the woods. Instead, he staggered back, unsure if his eyes were betraying him. Under the child's skin, dark lines coiled and branched like roots twisting through soil, moving with a slow, pulsating rhythm that didn't match a heartbeat or anything remotely human. The lines weren't tattoos or birthmarks. They appeared alive, shifting subtly, as if reacting to the sudden exposure. The other children bore the same strange patterns. When the sheriff wiped dust from the boy in the middle, the lines responded again, branching outward with the uneasy fluidity of something growing beneath the surface. It was as though the children were connected to the ground itself, their bodies carrying the memory of something buried deep in the earth. The sheriff's hands trembled despite his best attempt to stay steady, and the hunters took several steps back, whispering hurried prayers and insisting they leave the property immediately. But the sheriff couldn't bring himself to turn away. Something about the markings felt ancient, like symbols written by the land long before any human touched these mountains. As the fog pressed in closer, the children remained still, their eyes blank and unseeing, while the strange markings continued their slow, creeping movement beneath their skin, hinting that whatever had happened to them had not come from anything of this world. Town records about the Haverly Clan had always been sparse, scattered across dusty drawers in the courthouse basement, written in handwriting that grew shakier and darker the deeper the years went. But after the discovery of the children, the sheriff knew he had to revisit those files, even if they carried the weight of stories the town preferred to forget. The Haverlys had once been one of the oldest families in Harlan County, rooted in the mountains long before paved roads and electric lines carved their way in. People whispered that they understood the land too well, that they knew the mountains' moods like other families knew the faces of their children. But in 1957, their entire clan, 12 people in total, vanished overnight. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away from the property. The only clue left behind was the house, abandoned, the windows covered from the inside with layers of dirt and clay like someone had tried to seal it shut. As the sheriff flipped through the brittle papers, he found old complaints that suddenly felt more sinister than harmless gossip. Neighbors had reported strange lights in the woods at night, murmuring voices beneath the soil, and smoke rising from the barn even though no one ever saw a fire. One woman claimed she heard chanting coming from the Haverly property long after the family was supposed to be asleep. Another swore she saw a child with markings on her arms, dark and twisting, though no one believed her at the time because the Haverly children were rarely seen in town. They had been raised deep in the forest, kept close to the land by their elders, who insisted the mountain provided everything a soul needed if one learned how to listen. As he read further, the sheriff uncovered an unsettling pattern. Several reports mentioned that the Haverly patriarch had grown obsessed with something he called binding, a word that appeared repeatedly in old journal entries collected by a local historian decades earlier. According to those notes, the Haverlys believed the land held a spirit older than memory, and they sought a way to fuse themselves with it, to become more than human. The historian's records ended abruptly with a final entry mentioning a ritual meant to root the family forever. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, the weight of those words settling heavily across his shoulders. If the Haverly clan had truly attempted something supernatural, something that tied them to the land itself, then the children found in 1973 might not just be victims of an old disappearance. They might be the result of it. The last remnants of a family that had crossed a boundary meant to remain untouched. When the sheriff returned to the children after digging through the old Haverly records, he tried once again to coax some response from them. He spoke slowly, keeping his voice gentle, asking their names, their ages, whether they were hurt, whether anyone else was nearby. But the children didn't lift their heads or shift their weight or even blink in recognition. Their silence wasn't the silence of shock or fear. It was something deeper, something hollow, as if their minds existed in a place far from the present moment. Yet despite their lack of movement, they weren't completely unresponsive. Every time the sheriff or one of the hunters stepped too close, the dark markings beneath their skin shifted. It started with a faint ripple, like a distant vibration moving beneath the surface. Then the markings would twist, curl, and pulse in patterns that made no sense but felt uncannily deliberate. The sheriff noticed it first when he reached out to steady the smallest girl. As his hand hovered inches from her shoulder, the markings spread upward toward his touch, threading across her collarbone in one smooth, unnatural sweep. The child did not react outwardly, but the movement beneath her skin was so sudden, so fluid, that he yanked his hand back in alarm. As soon as he did, the markings retreated, sliding backward like shadows being pulled beneath the surface. The hunters, already shaken, muttered that the children were reacting to something they couldn't see or hear. One suggested they were possessed, another insisted they weren't human at all, and the tension between them grew with every passing second. To test his theory, The sheriff took a cautious step forward. The moment his boot touched the dirt in front of the oldest boy, the markings on all 3 children began to move at once. They shifted in the same direction, aligning like roots following the pull of underground water. The sheriff stood perfectly still, feeling the heavy pressure of unseen eyes watching from beyond the fog. It was as if the children sensed proximity not with their minds or eyes, but with something deeper, something tied to the earth beneath their feet. When he slowly backed away, the markings settled again, pulsing faintly, but no longer reaching outward. Even stranger was how their eyes tracked movement without turning their heads. Their pupils didn't shift, yet somehow they registered every motion around them. The sheriff waved a hand in front of the middle boy's face. The child remained motionless, but the markings on his throat vibrated softly, almost like a warning. It became clear these children weren't responding to typical human stimuli. They were reacting to something else entirely, something older and more instinctive, as though the lines beneath their skin weren't markings at all but signals. Messages traveling through roots connected to a source buried far below the soil. The discovery of the trapdoor happened almost by accident, though later the sheriff would admit he felt something drawing him toward the barn even before he stepped inside. The structure looked on the brink of collapse, its wooden beams bowed and soft with rot, the air smelling of mold and old earth. The hunters hesitated at the doorway, insisting nothing good had ever come out of that building when the Haverleys were alive, but the sheriff pushed forward with a lantern in hand. Dust swirled through the air like ash, and every step made the floor groan under his weight. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe signs that the children had been kept inside, scraps of clothing, footprints, anything that explained their presence. But the barn was empty, stripped bare except for old tools rusted into unusable shapes and bales of straw long turned to powder. He was about to turn back when the floor beneath him sagged slightly. It wasn't the usual creak of aging wood, but a hollow shift, as though something below had been disturbed. He knelt, pressing his hand to the boards, and felt the faintest tremor pulse upward. With the hunter's help, he cleared away debris and broken planks, revealing a rectangular outline that didn't match the rest of the floor. After tugging hard at a rusted iron ring half buried in grime, they managed to lift the boards, uncovering a trapdoor sealed shut by layers of dirt that must have been intentionally placed there decades ago. The darkness beneath was thick and stale, carrying a smell that didn't belong to any ordinary cellar. The sheriff lowered his lantern and saw a narrow wooden ladder descending into an underground chamber carved directly into the earth. The walls were packed dirt, reinforced with old beams, their surfaces etched with symbols he couldn't recognize: swirls, branching lines, shapes resembling twisted roots. As he climbed down, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew heavier, as if he had stepped into a place the ground itself had tried to keep hidden. The chamber wasn't large, but what it held made the sheriff's breath catch. In the center lay a wooden table covered with brittle journals, jars filled with soil samples, and a map of the Haverly property marked with strange diagrams. The journals were filled with desperate handwriting, pages describing rituals meant to merge the family with the land, to bind blood to root and root to bone. Some entries were frantic, talking about voices rising from the earth, instructions whispered at night, and the need to finish the binding before the mountain awakens. As he turned the final pages, his lantern flickered, and the ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots. He realized the chamber wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. The moment the sheriff climbed back out of the underground chamber, he sensed something had changed in the air around the children. The fog felt heavier now, pressing close to the ground in thick, coiling strands that clung to the children's legs like mist trying to reclaim them. The hunters had moved farther back, their nerves frayed, their rifles lowered but trembling in their hands. They pointed wordlessly at the children, and when the sheriff followed their gaze, he felt his stomach tighten. The markings beneath the children's skin were no longer faint, delicate strands. They had grown darker, thicker, branching up their arms and necks like living vines. What had once seemed like subtle patterns now pulsed openly, rising and falling in rhythm with something the sheriff couldn't detect. As he stepped closer, the markings reacted again, but this time the response was more aggressive. The dark lines surged upward, crawling toward the children's faces with a speed that made his breath stutter. The smallest girl's cheeks flushed with a faint, unnatural glow as the markings spread across her jaw, curling beneath her eyes like roots searching for sunlight. The boy in the middle let out a soundless gasp. No voice, no breath, just the faint widening of his eyes as the lines beneath his skin pushed outward in a surge of movement. It was as though something inside them had been activated, awakened by the sheriff's discovery beneath the barn. The sheriff looked around, trying to anchor himself in something familiar, but the woods felt wrong. The wind had died completely. Even the trees stood unnaturally still, their branches rigid, angled slightly toward the children as if listening. The ground beneath their bare feet shivered in small, uneven tremors, and each vibration seemed to correspond with the pulsing of the markings beneath their skin. The sheriff raised his hand, intending to test their reaction one more time, but before he could reach them, the children lifted their heads in perfect unison. Their eyes, once glassy and vacant, now gleamed with a dull, earthy sheen, as though reflecting something deep underground. The hunters stumbled backward, nearly tripping as fear overtook them. The sheriff felt it too, not just fear, but a heavy sense of inevitability, as though the land itself had been waiting for this moment. The markings no longer looked like veins or symbols. They looked like living extensions of the earth, like roots burrowing through flesh, claiming their territory inch by inch. When the children exhaled, slow, eerie, synchronized, the fog around them swirled upward in a twisting column, and for the first time the sheriff felt certain the transformation wasn't random. It was progress. It was growth. And whatever the Haverleys had done decades ago was now spreading, rising to the surface through the children's skin, preparing to reveal the full shape of what had been buried. The final revelation came in the moment when the sheriff realized the children were no longer entirely human. For days, he had watched them, studied the shifting lines beneath their skin, and felt the creeping dread that they were connected to something older and deeper than anything he could comprehend. Then, as the forest trembled around them and the fog coiled in unnatural spirals, the smallest girl, the one who had barely spoken a word, opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was not a child's voice. It was layered, strange, echoing with tones that seemed to vibrate from the ground itself, as though multiple voices were trapped within a single body. The words were intelligible, but they carried a weight far beyond human comprehension. "The land has remembered," she said, each syllable vibrating in tune with the trembling soil, "and it wants more." The sheriff's knees weakened, and the hunters froze in place, their eyes wide with terror. The fog swirled violently around the children, forming a moving shroud that seemed alive, responding to the cadence of the girl's voice. The markings on the children's skin writhed and twisted faster now, spreading across their faces and necks in patterns that resembled roots, veins, and branches all at once, merging into one living network. The forest seemed to lean closer, the trees creaking and groaning as if straining to listen. A low, resonant hum rose from the ground, harmonizing with the children's strange utterances, filling the air with a vibration that pressed against the bones and rattled the nerves of anyone nearby. It became clear that the ritual the Haverly family had attempted decades earlier had not only succeeded, but evolved in ways no human mind could have predicted. The children were the final result of a connection between human flesh and the land itself, vessels through which the mountain and its hidden forces could speak, move, and perhaps even exact control. The sheriff reached out instinctively, as if to reassure himself that the children were still children, still innocent. But the moment his hand hovered near them, the markings pulsed violently, a warning he could feel in the marrow of his bones. The children did not flinch, they did not smile. They simply waited, anchored to the earth in a way that defied reason. The hunters murmured prayers and attempted to retreat, but the land beneath their feet shifted again, subtly at first, then with greater force, like an uncoiling serpent stretching its body after a long sleep. The children's voices rose in tandem, a chorus that seemed to command the very soil, whispering to the roots buried deep below and the stones pressed into the earth for generations. The sheriff realized in a cold, undeniable certainty that these children had never been meant to leave the Haverly land. They were part of it, and now the land was calling. Whatever ancient presence had been waiting in the soil, sleeping beneath the barn and the forest floor, had awakened fully, and through these children, it was no longer content to remain silent.